When challenged to defend his direct action campaign, Martin Luther King penned a long letter, now famously known as the Letter from a Birmingham Jail. In it, he admitted that direct action should not be done on a whim. One has an obligation to carefully consider whether one is acting for justice, and one has an obligation to try other options, such as negotiation, to bring about just ends without such a disruption. But when there is injustice and all other options are blocked, then direct action becomes a legitimate tool. How do you tell if your direct action is going too far, if you've gone beyond the limits that morality allows? Clearly, there are cases, terrorist attacks, mass shootings, and the like, where individuals have taken direct actions that morality and justice do not allow. To this, King said that one had an obligation to obey just law, but this is consistent with having no obligation to obey unjust law. One can even have an obligation to break unjust law. King states, quote, "One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all." Now, note, King didn't say that unjust laws can simply be ignored. He says there's a duty to disobey such laws. But before we can make sense of this moral requirement, we need to have some idea of what an unjust law is. Here, King, in his letter from a Birmingham jail, gave us a number of ways to recognize whether a law is just or unjust. For his first test, King said, quote, "A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law." End quote. People may find this reference to God's law problematic, either because they deny the existence of a God, or they question King's version of divine commands. However, we can say that an unjust law is out of harmony with the moral law while leaving open the question of whether and which God is responsible for that law. If one holds that the treatment of blacks in Alabama in 1963 was unjust, then one must hold that there's some kind of moral law, though here the claim appears to be question-begging. Under the interpretation, King seems to be saying that an unjust law is a law that is unjust, which isn't helpful. King then says, quote, "Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority." End quote. This appears to be an Aristotelian account of law. Aristotle argued that one of the functions of law is to create a society in which the citizens can obtain virtue, in which they can be the best type of person they could be. Obtaining virtue in Aristotelian terms involves acquiring those character traits that are part of a good life, the Greek term eudaimonia. Among the injustices associated with segregation laws is that it teaches its victims a false attitude of inferiority to others. It diminishes their self-image and self-respect. These are ideas that King would come to express later in his famous "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington, D.C. He said, quote, "We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating 'for whites only.'" End quote. So that provides one account of the distinction between just and unjust laws. Unjust laws make false claims of superiority and inferiority. For another argument, King later wrote, quote, "An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself. This is difference made legal. By the same token, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow, and that it is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. So segregation laws are unjust because they don't apply to all people equally. A just law makes it a rule that all of us are required to or prohibited from performing some action. An unjust law is a law which a power majority, and I think we can say even a sufficiently powerful minority, says you must obey this law, but we don't have to. And for another test, King said, quote, "A law is unjust if it is inflicted on a minority that, as a result of being denied the right to vote, had no part in enacting or devising the law." End quote. This is an application of the principle that says that government gets its just powers from the consent of the governed, and in denying people a voice in the making of the laws, they create laws that are foisted on people unjustly, and because they did not give their consent to those laws, they also don't have an obligation to obey them. King augmented this by saying, quote, "Who can say that the legislature of Alabama, which set up the state segregation laws, was democratically elected? Throughout Alabama, all sorts of devious methods are used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. And there are some counties in which, even though Negroes constitute a majority of the population, not a single Negro is registered. Can any law enacted under such circumstances be considered democratically structured?" End quote. Given these tests for distinguishing just law from unjust law, King then moves on to endorse St. Augustine's formula that unjust law is no law at all. Now, in one sense, an unjust law must still be law, just as a red house is still a house. So, how do we make sense of this? The saying is actually using two definitions of the term law. The first definition applies to a statute approved by the government, be it a dictator or parliament or whatever form of government exists. The second definition has to do with how one ought to behave. Here, King is talking about the moral law, a law of morality that commands us to do or refrain from some action, not because the government commands it, but because it's the right thing to do. This slogan, "Unjust law is no law at all," simply states that unjust statutes don't have any morally binding force. They are not things that one has an obligation to do or refrain from doing. I want to illustrate this by looking at a promise as a point of contrast. A promise has a binding moral force. That is to say, once you've made a promise, a morally just person, a virtuous person, a person of good moral character, will feel a need to fulfill the promise. While clearly an immoral or an unjust person may not feel obligated to keep a promise, this is precisely what makes that person immoral. Breaking a promise is still something that it would be wrong to do. And this shouldn't be interpreted as saying that one's going to keep a promise no matter what. The fact that there's a binding moral force attached to keeping a promise is compatible with the possibility of finding oneself in a position where some other morally binding force is stronger. This is what's called a pro tanto obligation, an obligation that can be outweighed. Oh, you promised to meet your sister for lunch, but just as you're getting ready to leave, your child gets stung by a bee and is having an allergic reaction. The promise has a binding moral force. It's just not strong enough to outweigh the need to get the child to the hospital. An analogy between an unjust law and a promise would go as follows. So, you promise your roommate that you'll stop by the store to pick up groceries because I'm out of money and won't get paid until Tuesday. Then you discover that your roommate received $1,000 from their parents to cover groceries. It's not like the case of a promise being outweighed by another obligation. The obligation to keep the promise in this case vanishes entirely. Similarly, the obligation to obey the law vanishes entirely when the law is unjust. It's not being outweighed by a stronger obligation to establish a just society. If the law is unjust, there is no obligation to obey to be outweighed. That's what it means to say that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, the moral law still applies, regardless of statute. The wrongness of murder, rape, assault, theft, vandalism, and the like are still wrong, still things one ought not to do, even if there isn't a law against it. So, If a law against murder has been passed unjustly, it's still wrong to murder. So King aimed to defend direct action in response to unjust laws. In his defense, he argued that unjust law is no law at all. It's not binding on the conscience. One can't have a moral obligation to treat others or to be treated unjustly. In fact, one has an obligation not to treat others or to defend oneself from being treated unjustly. From this, King concludes that his direct action protests are legitimate.